Hi guys, this is Matt. You're watching The Joy of Hacking, and today we're going to be going over a penetration test report. Now, a report can actually be more important than the technical work that you've done to compile the report, because hacking can be super fun just to do it for fun, but at the end of the day, if you're trying to put a happy buck in your pocket, then when you're working with a client or a customer, what they are going to be buying from you is the test report, because the report is what they look at to be able to understand what you did, and even more importantly, to be able to take action on it. And if you're interested in working for a penetration testing company, then usually they will expect you to be able to put together a decent report as well, or at least compile the information so that a professional report writer can easily take the notes that you give them and compile it into a report themselves. Now, in order to put this report together, I have used a professional report template. I will put the link for it in the description down below so that you can download it yourself, or if you want to use a different template that you find, or even something that you create on your own, that's also perfectly fine. I really would suggest using some sort of template and getting comfortable with it though, because if you don't, it's just going to make your job more difficult in order to keep everything organized and make sure that you don't forget anything. A template kind of takes care of that for you, and then you just fill in the blanks as you go along. So it just makes life easier. All right, let's go ahead and go on up here and get started then. So the first thing that we have is the company name, or it could be your personal name if you're doing some sort of freelancing and just doing it under your own name. But in this case, as you can see here, we have The Joy of Hacking. Then next is the title of the report. So a lot of times customers will have a report done annually. So you can see here, this is just assuming that format. It's the 2023 Security Assessment Report prepared for, then the name of the company or client. In this case, this report is actually based on a CTF. It's called Blackgate, and it is available if you want to take a look at it and try to follow through this report to use it as a basis for repeating the results and get the same results on your own. It is available on Offensive Security's Proving Grounds Practice Lab. I'll have a link below in the description for that as well. And then moving down, we see when the report was issued. Next page, we have a confidentiality notice and a disclaimer, basically just some legalese. Now, in the template, this will have where it says like Blackgate here and The Joy of Hacking. You'll have to make sure and fill those in manually, but the rest of this is just kind of part of the template. And then moving down further, we have our table of contents. The really nice thing about this template is that with this, you don't have to worry about it too much, because you just fill in the rest of the template, and then when you're done, you can come up here and right click on it and click Update Table of Contents, and it just kind of fills all this out automatically. I did have to make a couple of tweaks to it to take some things out that it put in here that didn't really need to have their own entries in the table. But other than that, I would say 95% of this, it just automatically filled out with that little update table tool. And then moving down, next we have the executive summary. Now, the executive summary is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a summary for executive users. Think like your CISO or your CIO, CEO, maybe members of the board, or even other executives. I actually should say probably you want to aim it towards other executives rather than just the CISO, even because even a CISO might be able to understand and appreciate some of the other parts of the report, but someone like a CFO might be interested in the report overall, but is not going to be able to understand or want to take the time to try to understand the more technical aspects. So the executive summary is basically just saying what you did and what you found at a very high level. So this is saying that it simulated an attack from an external threat actor attempting to gain access to the system, and it found a number of vulnerabilities that are highlighted in this table below. 1 critical, 2 high, no mediums or lows. Now, also, you should understand for the purposes of this report that this is just one system, not an entire network. Most of the time, a report on something like a medium or large business would have much more findings in it than just this, but it'll still make sense within the context of what we're trying to convey here as it goes along. And then here's just some more information talking about what the findings mean. And this is an important note down here that is saying that you're not guaranteeing that you found all of the vulnerabilities, and that also this was just kind of a point in time snapshot. So if any changes were made during the test or if they're made afterwards, that could invalidate some of these findings or introduce more findings. All right, and then the next section that we have is going to be a high level assessment overview, and you'll see that as we go down in the report, the farther down we go, the more technical it's going to get. At this point, this is something that a middle manager or maybe director might be interested in. It's going to be a little bit technical, and it will have some specific suggestions for changes that can be made, but it's also not completely down into the nitty-gritty. It's at a level that someone with some operational understanding can understand and gain value from, but they don't necessarily have to be super well versed in the deep technical intricacies of cybersecurity. So how this is broken down is that it first goes over some strengths that were found, because we want to tell the customer what they're doing well as what they could be doing better, because that's just a nice thing to do, but it's also kind of a positive reinforcement thing, because we don't want them to go off and, when they're making changes, weaken something that they had been doing strong before, not realizing that they had been doing it so well to begin with. So with that being said, we go over our observed security strength, and there is only one here because, again, this is just one machine. The report is sort of written under the guise that like maybe there could be a network behind this, and this is just the one externally facing machine that we were able to compromise. But in a report, in most reports for, even a small business, you'd have more to work with than what's here. So, but this is just still going to give you a good idea of what these sections can look like. So the one strength that we did find is, in this case, that there were strong passwords set on the user system accounts, because after the team compromised the server, they exfiltrated all the user accounts and password hashes that were found on the system, tried to crack them, but were unable to do so, indicating that they were relatively strong passwords. Now, moving on to areas for improvement, these are things that can be changed, that based upon the findings that we discovered and the attacks that we conducted that were successful, these are things that could be changed to make it so that those attacks would not have been successful or would not be successful in the future. And it's split into short-term recommendations and long-term. So short-term recommendations, of course, are things that the customer could do right away without too much effort or change to the environment. And long-term are things that would take more planning and consideration and may take a little bit more time and effort to complete. So under short-term recommendations, the first thing that we mention is putting a password on a Redis instance. We're saying here that the Redis instance is the service that we attacked in order to gain initial entry to the system, and had it had a password, which it did not have any password at all, but had it had a strong password on it, then that would have stopped us in our tracks right there. And the path that we used to eventually fully compromise the system just would have dead-ended on us right then and there. So, and again, that's not something that should take too much time or effort to do, to slap that password on there. So we're saying that that's a short term, they should do that right away, because it's a very high value change, but should be able to be completed with minimal effort. And then going down here to long-term recommendations, again, these are things that are going to take a little bit more effort and time to get done, but could still pay dividends well enough that we're definitely recommending that they get done as soon as possible. Specifically in this case, we've mentioned over the next 6 months, but you could tailor that to the specific recommendations that you have, and maybe even any knowledge of the client and their operations that you have already from having talked to them throughout the assessment. So in this case, though, we're saying that they should update to the latest Redis version, because Redis 4.0.14 is the service that we attacked, but the current release is 7.0.12. And Redis 7 fixes a number of security vulnerabilities and introduces additional security controls such as access control lists. Now, that is specifically not necessary, though, in order to put that password on there. I just want to point that out real quick. This is a separate recommendation that can be done even before that upgrade happens. And then other long-term recommendation is to update the policy kit system package and associated packages, because as you'll see in a moment in the report, abusing a pull kit attack known as pwn kit is what we were able to do in order to escalate our privileges to root once we had initial system access. So, and if they had updated this up to the package included with the current Ubuntu long-term support release of 22.04, that would have stopped us from escalating privileges along that track. And then moving down, we have some information about the scope, and the scope is basically just saying what we had already agreed we would be attacking. So it's just kind of a reminder here. This is what we tested. This is what the systems that we launched attacks against. In this case, again, it is just the one system, but in a marginally large network, you would possibly have entire subnets here or entire lists of different subnets, and then over here we have just a note saying, this is what that system is. So in a subnet case, it could be a note saying, this is desktops, or this is servers, or something of that nature. And then included in the scope as well is any provided credentials. In this case, we were not provided any credentials before the testing began. In some cases, we might be just in order to speed up the testing, or because sometimes a client may assume that, hey, like given enough time, you could fish for these credentials or, discover them in some other way. So we want to see what would happen from an attacker perspective starting from that point in time without you spending months trying to eventually come up with a successful phishing campaign or something like that. In this case, again, we were not providing any credentials, so just makes note of that here. All right, and then next page is testing methodology. This is just some more kind of boilerplate stuff that just goes over and says like, hey, this is how we walked through the test. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this yourself, but this is just more important stuff for someone on the customer end who's not familiar with exactly what a penetration test looks like. This just helps them to visualize the workflow that you went through during your testing. And then we get a little bit farther down into the technicalities here with some classification definitions. So these classifications are going to be used over here in the findings when we get there. So this is just telling the customer, what does it mean when we say that it's critical or high or medium? And if we do say it's, a score of 8 or something, what does that mean as far as like, does that correspond to a high or a medium? Well, here's all that information. And then this is for risk classifications, and then exploitation likelihood classifications are a little bit simpler, and these can really be tailored to whatever you're comfortable with or whatever the client is expecting. These are more or less subjective in nature. There's no, this is just kind of your gut feeling about how you want to represent your findings based upon what you know about them, how easy they are to exploit, and the damage that could have been caused by a malicious attacker exploiting them instead of you. And so under the exploitation likelihood, we just in this case have used unlikely, possible, and likely. Then moving down, we have business impact classifications. So here we have major, moderate, or minor impact, and then remediation difficulty should be the last classification, which also is just split out into hard, moderate, and easy, telling the customer how much effort it's likely going to take in order to fix that vulnerability that this is labels being applied to. And then here we have our findings split out. This is just a last little overview of the findings until we get down into the real nitty-gritty of talking about each one in specific technical detail. But as you can see here, we do have 3 findings. The first is that Redis was running without a password. The second, the vulnerable Redis version. And the third, the vulnerable policy kit version. Now, these were all mentioned up in the summary before, but again, on a larger test with many more systems, you may have only mentioned 2 or 3 of the findings up in the previous summary. And then here you may have 20, 30 or more findings listed out. It's just because this is just the one CTF system that this is a little bit simplified. But again, we're not trying to give you something here that you would copy exactly on your own assessments, but just an idea that then you can make your own when you're doing your own assessment. So you can see here that it then shows the overall risk on the 1 to 10 scale, and then corresponding to low, medium, high, or critical, and then a number for the page that you can find the deep technical details of that specific finding on if you want to scroll down to one of them in particular. And then finally, we get into just about the last section. It is the last section of the main report. We do have some appendixes that we'll go over after this, but this is the last main section. And because of that, this is then the most technical section. So just giving a full detailed overview of each finding. And now for the sake of brevity, we're only going to go over one of these findings because they're all pretty much the same as far as the format. And so just covering one of them will give you a good idea of what that format looks like. If you do want to see all of them, you can download this exact report from a link in the description below. And while you're down there checking out that link, go ahead and leave me a comment as well. Just let me know if you like this video or if there's anything else that you would like to see in the future. All right, let's go ahead and go over this first finding here. This is finding number 1. Redis running without password. These findings are ordered from most to least critical, which is the way that I would recommend doing it in your own reports. So this first one here is the highest at critical risk, 10 out of 10. And that critical risk is a combination of these next two factors put together. The exploitation likelihood, in this case likely, which tells how likely the issue is to be able to be exploited by an attacker, followed then by the business impact, in this case major, which tells how much damage would be done if the issue comes to pass, if the attack is successful by an attacker. This last piece here, the remediation difficulty, in this case is easy. This is very important for the business to know because they will want to usually start with the low-hanging fruit on their end of what is easiest to remediate and do and make those corrections first. But it is also important to note that this does not impact the criticality. So in this case, it does happen to be easy to remediate, but even if it was difficult to remediate, the risk would still be the same. The risk would only change if, for instance, the exploitation likelihood was also more difficult, which could be the case if the remediation difficulty is difficult, but again, doesn't have to be a correlation there, and there won't always be one. Then we come down here to this next section, security implications. In this case, it's saying this finding allows an attacker to gain open access to the Blackgate Redis server, potentially allowing access to sensitive information. Chained with the next vulnerability, it allows remote code execution and full shell access to the machine. So just as it says in the title here, these are the reasons why the finding is a detriment to the organization's security. Then we come down here to analysis. As shown in figure 1 below, the currently running Redis instance is configured with no authentication. Using freely available tools, anyone with network access to the server can query the Redis instance for information, which can be valuable in a later stage of attack. If there was any sensitive data being served by Redis, that would be easy to dump as well. So again, this is just a little bit more of a deep dive saying how this finding could be taken advantage of and a little bit more information about the damage that would be done if it was taken advantage of. And then you notice here it mentioned figure 1 below, so let's take a look at that next. This is figure 1. It's just a screenshot showing the finding being abused. In this case, we just use Redis CLI, fed it the host name, the IP address, the port that the Redis server is running on, and hit go. It logged us in and dropped us into a shell in which we asked for info, and the Redis server gladly replied and gave us all this information about the server itself. Now, this information and this Redis command can only be executed by an authenticated user. So in this case, it's just showing that there was no authentication because we were just automatically authenticated because there was no password required. And then finally coming down here, we have recommendations and references. The recommendations are just kind of a step-by-step guide to exactly how to remediate the vulnerability, sometimes even giving specific commands when that is reasonable to do. In this case, we're recommending that they add a password to the Redis instance by running the following command with Redis CLI, config set require pass, and then the password. Also uncomment the line require pass in etc redis.conf and add the password there for persistence. So for when the Redis server is rebooted, it'll still maintain that password. And then a password configuration would have prevented the next next finding from working as described, though there could still be other vulnerable paths, and even though we're not going to cover the other findings on this video, it will completely make sense to you if you download the report and take a look at it yourself, and then you will see that the findings can reference each other, because the next finding, as it says here, would not have been a finding at all had we not been able to get to it by abusing this first finding. And then lastly, in the recommendations, it says if you cannot add a password to the Redis instance because of operational constraints, at a minimum, consider restricting network access to the server to only authorized personnel. So this is basically just a mitigating control, which is saying at a last resort, you should add a password or do whatever it says up here, but if you are not able to, this is like a bare minimum last resort to provide you with some protection. And then the last thing on the finding here is the references, and in this case it's a link to a Stack Overflow question, but it could be a vendor article, or it could be something that you've even written yourself and published on a blog. It could be anything that you want it to be. It's just something to give the client a jumping off point to do a deeper dive on their own if they want to more fully understand this issue or how to correct it. All right, and that is it for the main report. All that we have left at this point is just a couple of appendixes, so we'll just go through those real quick. And these aren't strictly necessary, but again, sometimes it can be, you know, what you would like to present to the client because you really feel like it would be useful to them, or it could be something that the client themselves requested because they're interested in it for their own purposes. But in this case, we have an Appendix A, tools used. We used Nmap, Redis CLI, and the Redis Rogue server. And here's what we used each tool for. Appendix B is the total path to system compromise. And in a network situation, this could also be a path to network or environment compromise, starting from the first system and, for instance, in an AD environment, going all the way to the final step being gaining domain admin privileges. So in this case, it was pretty quick on this one system, just the 3 steps, which correspond to the findings, but it doesn't have to. In this case, it just happens to. Last appendix here is just the engagement information. The client was Blackgate. The primary contact is Batman, the Dark Knight. Approvers are the following people who are authorized to change the scope of the engagement and modify the terms of the engagement, which would usually be directors or higher level managers or the CEO, CIO, people of that nature. In this case, we have Alfred Pennyworth and Robin, and then the version information for the report, because maybe there was more than one version or a retest, something of that nature happening. In this case, there wasn't, so just version 1.0, the date that it was compiled, and the description of it. And if there is more versions, you know, the description would be an indication of what is updated in this newer version of the report or why it was changed. And contact information, the name of the company or your name, the address of your company or your address that you're operating out of, phone number for your contact, and your email address. And that just about does it for the entire report. Now, the only other one thing I'm going to mention before I let you go is that you may have noticed that the report was a bit repetitive in some parts. But that is by design, because as we started to mention with the executive summary and the high-level summary, certain people are going to read certain parts of this report. Most of the employees at the customer's business are not going to read the entire report, especially in a business of some size. So it repeats some of the same information over and over again just because you want that some of that information to go to an executive who's going to read the executive summary, a manager who's going to read the high-level assessment, and then your individual contributors, your engineers and your analysts who are going to read the assessment findings. So just didn't want there to be any confusion about that, or you to be thinking, hey, you know, Matt, what are you doing? Why did you repeat yourself so much? Again, it is very much by design for that reason. All right, and that should just about do it for today. So before I do let you go, I just want to say thank you very much for joining me today and inviting me onto your phone or tablet or whatever device it is that you use to watch these videos. And a big shout out to my subscribers. As of the recording of this video, there's over 100 of you, and I cannot tell you how much it tickles me that you liked my content enough to subscribe. And if you're new and you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe on your way out, because it really helps out the channel when you do. That being said, I'll see you next time, and until then, happy hacking.